So Dustin, this conversation's part of our series focusing on the 10 Commandments and how they apply to our lives. Today, it's a fairly unique topic. Today, the 7th commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. I mean, what's wrong with having an affair?
Well, that's a big question for a Monday morning, Corinne. Well, that would be a question a lot of people would ask. What's the big deal with an affair? Like, isn't sexual freedom a good thing? Isn't sexual expression a really good thing? And the messaging in our culture around sex is constant, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's almost like everywhere you look, there is sexual messaging of some form, whether it's in advertising, social media reels, movies, sex sells is the old adage. And so, it really is everywhere. And I kind of have this suspicion that sexual messaging is everywhere, not because people want the best for our soul and for our lives, but because people want our money. And as C.S. Lewis says, a man with an obsession is a man with very little sales resistance. And so, there's constant messaging in our culture about sex, which is why this 7th commandment just seems so archaic.
And I mean, it's pretty, the messaging around it is pretty contradictory as well, because, you hear on the one hand, look, it's not a big deal. Mm-hmm. It's, just worry about your freedom, whatever. But then it's also something that's so defining of a person.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it, that as you point out, in one breath, people will say, it's just a casual hookup. Sex is nothing. It's just whatever. But then so many voices in culture make out that, your sexuality is the single most defining attribute of your life. And if you don't have sexual expression, whatever that means, if you don't have sexual freedom, then you are going to be an unfulfilled human being. And so there really is a contradictory nature to a lot of pop culture's ideas and messaging around sexuality, which I think is why we should consider some of the ancient wisdom when it comes to sex and wholeness for our lives.
Because most of us would assume that the Bible doesn't really have anything, certainly of significance, to say about sex, or certainly to the modern person.
Yes.
But I thought you outlined it pretty well in the message yesterday. Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, I think your point is good. I don't think anyone today is thinking like, where can I go for some sex advice?
Yeah, straight to the Bible.
The Bible. That'll be the first book I'll get off the shelf. Most of us assume the Bible has nothing to say about sex because, in Bible times, people didn't have libido, right? Like we don't even correlate ancient periods of history with sex. We think whatever they've got to say, it's going to be irrelevant and archaic. But people are people at any point in history.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I find most interesting about the Bible's perspective of sex is really contained in the first reference to sex in the Bible. So if you're unfamiliar with the Bible, the first book of the Bible is a book called Genesis, and Genesis is the biblical story of origins, so the origins of humanity, and it really frames up some of the big ideas about how us humans are wired and these key elements of what it means to be human, how they are to work in our life according to God's wisdom. Things like sex, family, stewardship of creation, the environment, all of these things are really contained in the first few pages of the Bible. And so the first reference to sex in the Bible is found in Genesis chapter 2. And it says that a man will leave his father and his mother, move out of home, in other words, stop living in your mum's basement, and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And so I guess if there's a key word in that sentence, it's this idea of one.
Right.
So whereas the modern idea of sex to many people is it's a very casual thing, and there's, there doesn't even really have to be much meaning or connection behind it. That's very different to what the Bible presents. The first idea the Bible presents about sex is that it creates oneness. And not just physically, but it creates a unity among two persons. What's interesting is that this idea of one in the Bible, that the two shall become one, it's not the idea of one as in singular, like one coffee cup. It's the idea of a unity in diversity. So you've
Right.
got more than one party, but they are joined as one. So in the
Kind of
message,
like the Trinity.
yeah. If you want to get all theological on us, Corinne, I was just going to use a football analogy. When you watch a football team and they play really well, you might say they played as one.
Yeah.
Obviously, there was many players on the field, but they were so in sync. They were so unified. It was like they were one. And so this is the Bible idea of marriage and sex, that you've got two parties and yet they become one. What's really fascinating is the same word that the Bible uses to describe sex is the word that God uses to describe himself.
Right.
Now, for some of us, that's like, whoa, all right, God and sex in the same sentence.
Yeah.
Like, didn't see that coming. In the Hebrew tradition, there was a prayer that Jews would pray every day called the Shema. And it's a very short prayer. And it goes along these lines: Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. And it's this same word that the Bible uses to describe the union of man and woman in a marriage. And so when we understand this idea, we understand that if God is one, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, that's the Christian faith tradition of God, that there's a plurality about God, and yet there's a oneness to God. If God is one and human beings are made in God's image, and God is the creator, then it would make sense that God has, I guess, imprinted his nature upon the fabric of creation, and that God has actually imprinted his nature upon the fabric of our own souls.
Yeah.
We are made in his image. And so God is three but one. Marriage is a picture of two becoming one.
Yeah.
And so sex is not just about pleasure. It's not just about procreation. Sex is about reflecting the nature of God.
Yeah.
That was my very long-winded answer to your question.
Which makes sense, because it's obviously why so many people feel torn apart as a result of when things go wrong.
Yeah. I was in preparation for this message, which is available on our YouTube channel. I was researching the Ashley Madison website.
Right.
Now, Ashley Madison is a website for extramarital affairs.
Yeah.
By the way, I researched it at 9 a.m. in the morning with my
Yes.
wife in the same room.
Yeah, thanks
Just
for
in case the IT manager at the workplace wants to pull me up on that. And, what's crazy is that the Ashley Madison website boasts 75 million members worldwide. In 2015, there was a data leak from the Ashley Madison website. And the names of about 30 million cheating spouses was published online.
Oh, wow.
And it turns out sex is a big deal.
Yeah. Yeah.
It turns out affairs do have consequences, because that resulted in divorces, mental health issues. It even resulted in suicides.
Yeah.
And I think that's because of what you point out, that when people have an affair, when there is sexual infidelity, people will say things like, man, it's torn me apart. It's torn our family apart.
Yeah.
It's funny when we use that language, we're actually communicating a Bible idea without even knowing it.
Right.
Because this Bible idea that underpins this commandment is that the nature of God has been imprinted upon our soul, upon creation. And sex was designed to join together a man and a woman as one, to remain as one in unbroken relationship like God.
Yeah.
And so that's why Jesus said, what God has joined together, let no man separate. In other words, don't tear it apart, because when you tear apart a marriage, you actually tear your own soul apart. And so this idea of, it's just sex, it's just a bit of consensual extra fun. Well, no, actually it tears us apart. We damage ourselves.
Yeah.
And I think God knows that. And so that's why God gives this command.
And just lastly, I mean, we're talking about two imperfect people who have to do this journey together. I think it was J. John who said, if more marriages focused on courting, then fewer marriages would end up in court. You went through some practical ways of, how to improve your marriage, or what you should be doing to affair-proof your marriage.
Yeah.
Can you run us through just some of those?
Yeah, I think very few, this is my suspicion. My suspicion is very few people think, you know what, I'm just going to ruin my household by having an affair. That's going to be an excellent idea.
A lot of the time they're like, how did I get here, actually?
They'll say things like, I just don't know how it happened. Jesus was really insightful. Jesus took this commandment and he actually raised the bar. He said, if you look at a woman with lustful intent, then effectively you've broken this commandment. Because Jesus understood that ultimately our thoughts become our actions.
Right.
And no dude has ever jumped into bed with a woman that's not his spouse and without first having already slept with her in his mind.
Right.
It starts in our imagination, and Jesus knew that. So one of the best things we can do is guard our thoughts. Mm-hmm. People tell themselves a ton of lies before they ever get into an affair. It's fine. It's just a work colleague. We just get along well.
Yeah, rationalize it.
Yeah.
Which is just a bunch of lies, essentially. Yeah.
Totally. It's just a ton of self-deceit. And so we need to guard our thoughts. I think for anyone who's married and is listening to this or watching this, one of the best things we can do is invest into our marriage. We invest into so many other areas of our life, but we don't invest into our marriage. And so it's not just about avoiding the negative. No, let's promote the positive, invest into our marriages, because ultimately I think the reward that comes with having a unified family, a great legacy, a good reputation, I think that is far more meaningful than just, a fling in a hotel room.
Yeah. And if you missed that, episode, that message on the seventh commandment.
Yeah, it was a bit of an episode, a message, yeah.
On the seventh commandment, you can catch it on our YouTube and our podcast or any of the messages as we walk through the 10 Commandments. Thanks for your time.
Pleasure. Thank you.